Welcome to the Hangar Z podcast, brought to you by Vertical Helicasts. In this two-part series of the Hangar Z podcast, Jack Schonely and John Gray welcome Randy Rowles onto the podcast. Randy shares his inspiring journey from dropping out of high school to becoming the owner and president of the Helicopter Institute. He discusses the pivotal moments in his life that shaped his passion for flying, the importance of mentorship, and the challenges he faced along the way. Randy's story is a testament to resilience, determination, and the power of community in achieving one's dreams. In this conversation, Randy Rowles shares his journey through the helicopter industry, emphasizing the importance of networking, career transitions, and the impact of relationships on professional growth. He discusses his experiences at Bell Helicopter, the challenges faced during his time at Silver State, and the founding of the Helicopter Institute, which has become a family business dedicated to high-quality training. Randy's story highlights determination, grit, and the significance of mentorship in shaping one's career. Thank you to our sponsors Bell, Summit Aviation, and Spectrum Aeromed.
Welcome to the Hangar Z podcast, brought to you by Vertical Helicasts. The Hangar Z podcast is the first and only podcast dedicated to promoting and exploring the personnel and equipment behind the missions in public safety aviation. Join your host, John Gray, Jeff Ratkovich, and Jack Schonely.
Still southbound, skidding to a stop. Stand by here. Looks like you're getting ready to bail. Heads up, guys, bailing. Okay, the guy, he's running through the house, jumping the fence, threw the shotgun, threw something out. Grabbing the shotgun. Don't go over that fence. Don't go over that fence. Grab the shotgun again. He is armed. Stay there. Hold your position.
4 on the stop. You're in custody.
Good advising code 4 on the stop.
Welcome to the Hangar Z podcast. I'm your host today, Jack Schonely. With me is the creator of the Hangar Z podcast, John Gray. John, how are you today?
Wonderful. Yeah, really excited for today's conversation.
Oh, me too.
Yep.
Me too. This is going to be very fascinating. It's a great story, and I'll just say as part of the introduction here that we're going to talk to someone today that many of our listeners know, at least know of, if not know personally. And it's a person that dropped out of high school, ended up getting his GED, flew helicopters at 17, got his commercial license at 18, and ends up the owner and president of the Helicopter Institute in Fort Worth. How does that happen? This is a great story. It's a great story about resilience, determination, passion, skill, and I'm anxious to hear everything in between all that, because we're going to try and cover as much as we can. We would need 5 hours for this guest today. There's no doubt about it, but we've got a couple because he's a busy man. So I'd like to really thank and welcome Randy Rowles to the Hangar Z podcast. Randy, welcome.
Hey guys, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here, Jack, John. Thank you. I can't tell you how excited I am to have an opportunity, one, to speak with friends, but also to just have a great conversation. So thank you for the opportunity.
We've wanted this for a while, and we talked about it. We talked to you about it. You're a busy guy. I mean, you're one of the busiest people I know, and you have a lot of things going on. So for you to give us a little bit of time today in between training, and we were just chatting offline about, after this, you're going right into a ground school for NVGs, and boom, 4 flights. That just shows you that's an average day for you, I think, from based on what I know. So let's kick it and get into this, because there is a really fascinating story in between all this. So take the mic and run with it, Randy. Tell us about where you grew up a little bit, and that the flying, how that started, because that's one of the coolest parts of this whole story.
Well, I thank you guys again very much. I will say that my life is one big blessing. I've really met a lot of great people, and the people in my life have guided my life. And that really is, this is going to come full circle in this conversation. You'll see it starts with people, and it really, even today, it's just the people. But I grew up in West Palm Beach, Florida, and my dad was a mechanic on a golf course. And he really was probably the one that got me into aviation, not because it was a part of his life, but it was something he had wanted to do his whole life. And as a young person growing up, his father wouldn't let him. He was not allowed to do it. And so I always tell him, he passed away back in 1996, but I told Dad early on, he was living vicariously through me. And once I became a flight instructor, I should charge him for that. But I thought that would be appropriate. But in all seriousness, as a kid, I think everyone that listens to this, and both of you probably share this, when you're a kid, aviation, it's intriguing. It's something that you see these things in the air, they make cool noise, and cool people get in and out of them, and that really just attracts you to it. And growing up, I would say the first time that I had an opportunity to engage with an aircraft, I was about 10 years old. And if you remember the Jerry Lewis Telethon, the Jerry Lewis Telethon for years and years, well, Channel 12, WPEC TV 12 in West Palm Beach, remember very, very well. That station had a lot to do with my career, and I didn't know it, of course, as a kid. But on the Jerry Lewis Telethon, they would fly in the original Channel 12 helicopter, Sky 12. And they flew in one year, and they would show it sitting out back, and they opened up donations for cars to drive up, and people could donate to the telethon. So I had a wild hair. I had $5. I was about 10 years old, and I was watching my niece. She was probably about 8. And so it was about a 4-mile walk, but I figured, let's go. Parents weren't there, so I left. So we walked to the Channel 12 station with $5 and gave my donation so I could see the helicopter. And this was in a place called Mangonia Park when I got to the station. And we gave them the $5, and, we walked over to see the helicopter. I met the pilot. And of course, after a few minutes, they realized that our parents weren't there and wondered how I got there. And at least we got a ride home. The police department gave me a ride home. So that worked out pretty good. But there's an irony. It started my career. I met a guy by the name of Wayne Wiesman. Wayne was the pilot of that helicopter. And at the time, of course, I didn't know his name. I was young. But years later, I met him again. And he became a very, very close friend and a mentor in the industry. We actually didn't know years later, remember that moment until I had some pictures and he and I were talking and we're like, that was you? And he goes, that was you? And of course, that's the way it happened. Another connection to that TV station is that in 1990, the company I was working with, actually reinstituted Sky 12, and I flew that helicopter for many, many years.
Oh my gosh.
Worked the station and did some on-air reporting, and it was an amazing time. But that's the circles that I was talking about, and so it all started back then.
That is a great story. I mean, we ask a lot of people that question, and there's some cool stories, but that's really cool. I mean, the fact that you end up flying for that station, the fact that you meet him later in life, the pilot, and become friends, that is awesome. And there's a beginning to everything, and that is so cool that that's your beginning. So next step, you're 10 when that happens. Lead us up to that time when you're 17 now, and did things continually happen with aviation in that time period? I mean, was your interest, obviously your interest was sparked, but did it continue to grow steadily between that and when you started flying?
Oh yeah, man. It was so, to get into it, the meat and potatoes, I guess, the chronological order. So my dad, again, when I was 13, took me to an air show. And at that air show was at just south of Palm Beach International Airport, a place called Lantana Airport. Went there, took a ride in an old Tri-Islander. Anybody that ever remembers those, with 3-engine airplane, they fly in the Bahamas all the time. And of course, I got the last seat under the engine with my dad, and I flew it around. It was a neat experience. But there was also a Bell 47J model, and the J model has the pilot sitting by himself up front, 3 across the back. That aircraft was the first presidential helicopter under Eisenhower. A lot of people don't realize that, but I got a ride in it. And I landed, and I still to this day don't know how my dad did this. I mean, the rides back then were $25 a piece, and today they're $25 a piece. So I don't know how he paid for it, but I landed and he said, "Did you like it?" I said, "Dad, that was amazing." And he said, "You want to try it one more time?" And I said, "Absolutely." This time I made sure I was on the right side where the door was open, and I took that ride, and I knew right then. I was like, man, this is what I want to do. It's the magic carpet, man. There's just an amazing element to it. And I knew nothing about the industry. Nothing at all. On my 14th birthday, my dad bought me my first flight lesson, and he did so in a Cessna 152 at Palm Beach International Airport. It was a place called Air Rizzo. They're long gone, but a guy named Larry Rizzo owned it. Larry was a great, great guy. And I went there and I took my first lesson and I went out over the Everglades. And I remember looking down at a flock of these beautiful white birds. I mean, there are thousands and thousands of them. And as I'm looking down, I can remember this like yesterday. I saw their shadow, but I also saw the shadow of the airplane that I was flying. And it was among their shadows. And I thought, you know, how can this be wrong? I mean, this is an amazing thing to do. So I came back, landed, and my dad and my mom picked me up, and they asked me. My dad said, "What did I like?" I said it was great. This is an amazing experience. Thank you. And he said, "Well, I can't pay for any more." He said, "But I make one recommendation." He said, "You need to hang out where the airplanes live." And I got the messaging real clear. And so that was in middle school. Ironically, the same time that happened, I had just met the young lady that was going to be my future wife. And so Samantha and I had met. And so she's been there since my first flight. We were in, band class together. So I had a lot of first and a lot of long time things and what I would call stability. Stability, I tell people, anybody ever flies with me, they'll hear me say this: stability leads to predictability. And I never knew how important that was back then. Another piece of my dad back then that was unique, my dad and his dad before him and his dad before him, alcoholism runs very, very strong in my family. And my dad was, when he drank vodka, Smirnoff vodka was his thing. I don't know if I can tell the name of these things on your show. I apologize, but that's a fact. That's what he drank. And so, a fifth of vodka was my dad's drink, and he would drink lots of those in a day. And I always call my dad a holiday drinker because he would usually start around Thanksgiving and end around Easter. That's kind of the way it worked. That was his holiday drinking. And usually when dad started drinking, what would happen is, I always say that when dad was sleeping on the couch when I came home, I was good. But if dad was sleeping on the floor and there was red snapper burning in the kitchen, I was probably moving in 2 weeks. That was usually a pretty good rule of thumb,
Yeah.
So all of this introduction by my dad into aviation, plus some of the weird stuff that was going on, it actually drove me to want to get away from the house whenever some of the bad things would happen. And what I found early on within aviation is that being the kid around the airport, that was a place I could go that people would accept me. They never really cared about what was going on. And they didn't ask many questions, and as long as I was willing to work and wash aircraft and help out, I was solid. And so from starting that first lesson at 14 and going up to, that 16-year-old time frame, everything was good. It was really, really good. I met a lot of good people. One of the folks that I met, her name was Peggy Lang. And Peggy was a co-pilot for a car dealership in West Palm Beach, at a place called Wayne Acres Ford. Or excuse me, Roger Dean Chevrolet, different place. I gave a lot of money to Wayne Acres Ford. That's why that one stuck out. But Roger Dean was the good one. So Roger Dean Chevrolet, the captain's name was Clark Gable. There's an irony there. That was his name. And Peggy Lang was her name. They had a Citation 3. And she took a liking to me, being around the airport all the time. Really, really nice lady. And between what was going on with dad and in life, and I really wanted to fly, at one point, I realized that, I didn't want to be in high school anymore. And I hated where I was at, to be honest with you. And so I quit school. And there were some other things that were going on in school. Samantha and I had gotten real close, and we ended up getting pregnant in high school. And it was a great party, but probably not the right ending. But at the end of the day, I got out of school and for all the wrong reasons. And everybody at the airport that found out about it closed the door on me. They all said, They actually didn't say very much at all. I wasn't welcome anymore, and they needed me to go back to school. And we all know why, as adults now, why they were doing that. I get it, and I appreciate it. But they talked me into trying it again, and I went back, and they said, you can figure this out. And I was there 2 days, and I had no interest in figuring it out. I didn't want to go back. I didn't like the environment. It didn't scratch the itch that I really wanted in life. So I left school again, and I got a call from that lady, Peggy Lang. And I remember she left a message at my house, and she said, I need you to be in my office tomorrow morning. So in addition to her working as a co-pilot for the car dealership, she was also the program director for the Palm Beach Community College Aviation Program in West Palm Beach. So I showed up at the college at her office, and she had a little piece of paper. It said Boca Raton High School, Thursday night, 6 p.m. And she had taken the liberty to sign me up for a GED. She didn't trust me to do that. So probably very smart. And so I went down there and I passed it. Now I got my GED, and that changed everything for me. And she said, all right, the next thing I want you to do is find some money and sign up for some ground schools at the college immediately and get in my classes. And that is when I say people, that's what I mean. That she really, really set me on a direction that got me back at the airport, got me a little bit of education, and gave me that support that she just did not have to do in any way, shape, or form. Now, I got to take a step back. You asked me about things to talk about. I think statute of limitations and things like that are gone for a lot of different things. So I'll tell you another piece.
Thanks to our sponsor, Summit Aviation, a full-service provider for business, government, parapublic, and military aviation, specializing in maintenance, modifications, avionics, interiors, and paint. Discover more at summit-aviation.com.
You know, when I was getting out of school, you're 16, 17 years old. Once I had turned 17, I needed a job. I needed a job bad. And I looked at different opportunities at the airport, but you had to be 18 at the airport. And so I went to Palm Beach International Airport and was going to apply for a job. And I walked in, I knew you had to be, 18 for this. So I figured I just lie about my age and let's see what happens, see if it gets through. Well, I walked in and the young lady, which I still know today very well. She might've just retired, but this is a long time ago, but she worked there for many years. And her name was Cassandra, and she was on a typewriter. Somebody would give a white piece of paper and she would type this out, boom, make a badge and hand them their badge. And it was a Department of Airports badge, but had a state seal on it. So I figured, what the heck? And then I thought about it and I said, well, if I'm going to lie about my age, I might as well be 21. There's a lot of reasons to have an ID, that the state ID says you're 21. So I did. And I got my ID. And so it said I was 21 years old, and my wife still has that ID. She keeps that. She thinks it's actually kind of cute. But, I was able to get a job, and at 17, I got a job fueling for a company called ASI and at the airport. And I wasn't making hardly any money, but they immediately put me on the Delta Airlines aircraft. So I was 17, driving a 10,000 gallon fuel truck.
Wow.
And my life kind of looked like, at 7 a.m., I started classes at Palm Beach Community College. I was done at 1. At 3 p.m., I was starting work at the airport, and, I would work there. And what that allowed me to do was think. I had a lot of time to think. My first class in college was a psychology class by a guy named Mike Miles, Dr. Miles. And he knew what I was doing. And he said, listen, man, I know you're tired, in the mornings. I could do it. So he said, if you just want to record class, feel free. And so another guy, kid named Eric Dominguez, I gave him a recorder and remember those little tape cassettes way back then? So I bought one, gave it to him, and he would record my class. But one of the things that, even though he was a psych teacher that he talked about, he always asked a question. He said, why not you? He said, one question you should always ask in life is, why not me? When you're watching other people and you see their success, the first thing you should not ask is, I can't do that. That couldn't be me. The question you should ask is, why not me?
Yeah.
And, that was a huge, huge thing.
Oh my gosh.
And so I started thinking that way, and I never stopped thinking that way. And I would see things and people and I'd say, if they can do it, I can do it.
Mm-hmm.
And that was really a big piece of the puzzle. There's still a whole lot more there in that story that goes along, but she got me in class and got the GED. I was able to move on. I got the job. That led me to a meeting and another meeting. And I was also, while you're working there, I was working with other people. There was an irony. Samantha's dad worked for Delta Airlines and he worked there, but I didn't. It was an interesting thing when you see this guy and it was an interesting scenario because I was they were not a fan of me back then. That took a few years for me to grow on them. But, there was a lot of irony at that point. But I went working back to the other side of the airport, to an FBO. And when I went to that FBO, I met some folks at a place called the South Florida Water Management District and got to know them. I was fueling there. And these guys were all Vietnam era helicopter pilots, a guy named Mike McCone and J.K. Wells and all these. I mean, it was just a great group of folks. And there was another guy named Tom Renison. I'm going to come back to him in just a minute. And I want you guys to know this is one of the funnest things I've ever done in my life right now. I'm going back in time and I'm talking about stuff that I've not thought about in years. So if I talk too much, stop me.
Oh, no,
I apologize.
Randy. You just keep talking, baby. This is wonderful.
It's so cool that, some of these people, but old Tom Renison, we called him Poppy, So while I was fueling, I wanted to learn to fly helicopters because I knew I had been flying air. I got to fly the airplane, got my private on 17 because remember I said I was washing aircraft and I traded it. So I'm 17, I'm moving along, I'm in my fuel truck, and I had met a guy at the Lantana airport where I had started flying. He'd come in, he had bought a little R-22, and he moved into a hangar that I'd been working and cleaning and so forth. And when he had his helicopter in there, I didn't know him yet, but I'm not going to clean around his helicopter. That's rude. So I just started cleaning up, taking out the trash and helping him out, doing stuff, even though I'd never met him. And one day he introduces himself, and his name is Brian Parker. And great guy, still has helicopter companies, but he owned the original Palm Beach helicopters. And I say original, I'll get to that in a minute.
Yeah.
So he owned this company. And while I was sitting in my truck and I had heard what Dr. Miles said about why not you, I started thinking, well, how do I make this happen? And so I couldn't go to the bank because I had lied about my age. Remember, I can't get a loan. So I'm only 17. But I knew how loans worked. And I got it on my fuel truck one night. I wrote down on a legal piece of paper. I went to Brian and I said, you have a lot of economic Olympians that you've trained, doctors, lawyers, and so forth. And, they got money. At least that's my perception of doctors and lawyers. They got money. So I wrote down 3 loan options and repayment plans that maybe he could present to one of his economic Olympian students that may invest in my future and I could pay it back. So I presented it to Brian. And a few days later, Brian calls me back at the house and he says, hey, I found somebody to pay for your training. Come back in, let's talk about it. Oh my goodness gracious, this is amazing, right? So I go back to him and he says, here's the deal. I will pay for your flying, but I want to start a crop dusting business in Georgia. And if I teach you how to fly, I want you to come to work for me and help me start that business. It's like, well, where do I sign? I mean, you're going to teach me and give me a job to pay back the loan. This is a great opportunity.
Winning.
So I did it. And he trained me up in an R-22. And then on my 18th birthday, I was able to get my certificate, my commercial certificate. About a week later, I left. But there's an interesting story of me leaving. I told you about my dad and I told you my mom. So during that 17-year-old period, my mom and dad had separated. And my mom had very little to do with my dad. She, and it makes sense, right? And I remember driving by where my dad was. He lived by himself. And I remember this voice coming over me. I mean, it was like, I don't know if you ever had a situation where something come over you so heavy that you can't help but act.
Yeah.
And my dad and I were very strained, but that voice said, go check on your dad. And so I turned left, went down the road and pulled up and man, he was 1 foot on the grave and 1 foot in a banana peel type situation. Bad, the house. I mean, just, alcoholism, what it does. Yeah. And so I scooped him up and I took him to the hospital. And I took him to the hospital in West Palm, a place called St. Mary's Hospital. And I put him in there and didn't tell my mom at all what I had done. And so they took great care of him, got him back up, and he was there about a week. And, kind of the city, county had their program, so they took care of it. So I solo on my 18th birthday. All this is happening behind the scenes, and my dad's in the hospital. So my mom's there, and I solo, and everything keeps going. About a day or two after my birthday, I know I'm leaving soon, and my dad had to go somewhere out of the hospital. So I bring him home, sort of like finding a puppy. I brought my dad home, and so I brought him to the house, and my mom's like, "What are you doing? What is happening here?" And I said, "Well, here's the situation. So my family makeup was very unique. My dad had 2 daughters, and my mom had 4 kids when they got married. It's like the Brady Bunch. I was the only one of that marriage, and it came probably a decade later. And so my parents had never been alone, ever, ever. And so when I dropped my dad off at the house, he was staying there. They were a little bit, at odds. Well, I got the word I had to leave. I was about 2 days later. I grabbed a bag and I was gone. So my parents were now thrust into this relationship. And I'm proud to say that until the day my dad died, my parents got together after that. My dad never drank again. And I think that bond was because they were alone. It happened.
Yeah.
And so anyway, that was something that was kind of cool. I didn't have to worry about my mom or my dad when I went flying.
Yeah.
They were together. And so I went to Georgia, did a season up there, flew a bunch. And I came back to West Palm and went right back to that fueling job that I had prior with those guys at Water Management. And so the first thing that this guy, Tom Renison and Mike Bacone, all the old Army dudes, what did they say? They said, "Hey, Randy, you need to go in the Army." And so I put together a warrant officer package and put it in. And I hadn't heard anything for a while, right? So I'm still doing some stuff on the side, cleaning, flying, doing little things here and there. But one day, this guy, Tom Renison, that I called Poppy, he comes walking out and he says, "Hey, have you heard anything from your recruiter yet on this warrant officer package?" And I'm like, "Oh, no, I have not." And he said, "What's his name?" I said, "Well, his name is Sergeant Joe Friendy." Sergeant Joe Friendy. He said, "All right, well, thanks a lot. I'll see you later, Randy." Well, the next morning at my house, I got a phone call at 8:00 from Sergeant Joe Friendy. And he's like, "Mr. Rowles, good morning. So-and-so, would you like to go out to breakfast with me? I want to talk about your package." I'm like, "It's ironic. I was just talking about you yesterday, So I go to breakfast, and of course, after breakfast, and they line me up for MEPS and all the stuff I'm going to do in my physical at Homestead Air Force Base. He asked me, he says, "Well, how long have you known Colonel Renison?" I said, "Colonel who?" And come to find out, Tom Renison was the Southeast Liaison Officer for West Point as a reservist. And so he writes me this great letter, and all this stuff. But in many ways, the good Lord has other plans. And so I went through the whole process, and then I failed out with my eyes. I went 2025, and back then, this is 89, whatever it was. So back then, there were no waivers or anything like that. So my career, as we go through phase 1 of this discussion, my career at becoming a new helicopter pilot, a commercial helicopter pilot, why not go in the military? It all ended right there when I couldn't pass that first class flight, that flight physical. But to put the icing on first phase of your career, I met the greatest guy in the world. So I had been an explorer at the sheriff's department. They had assigned me as an explorer, extended usually at 18 you're out. They extended my time frame in the explorers a little bit. It's through the Boy Scouts, but they allowed me to stay there after I was 18. So I was now a commercial helicopter pilot, and I was assigned as an explorer to the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Aviation Unit. And they had a guy come in. He was the chief pilot for Bell Helicopter, and his name's Gary Young. And I met Gary there at the sheriff's office. The next couple days later, I was scheduled to fly with him down at the Lantana Airport for an operator I was working with, and I flew with Gary. And I remember that moment, that blue flight suit, that opportunity to do some flying that I had never, ever seen before in a helicopter. And I knew at that moment, he asked me what my goals were. What are your dreams? What do you want to do in the industry? And I said, "I want your job. I want to fly for Bell Helicopter, and I want to be an instructor pilot and do what you do every single day. This is what I want to do." And at the end of that flight, Gary said, "Well, you need a mentor." And he gave me his home number, and he gave me his office number, and he became a mentor to the rest of my career. And today he's on my board of advisors and one of my dearest friends. And as my second dad, he's been very close with my whole career.
Incredible, Randy. I mean, I hate to even stop you here, but I need to stop you and ask you a little bit more detail about something. Tell us about Georgia. Tell us about the airframe, what you were doing in that airframe, and what that was like, and lessons learned. I mean, I know you learned stuff. I mean, that's your first flying job, but tell us about that year and a half or whatever it was. Tell us about that.
Thank you to our sponsor, Spectrum AeroMed. Spectrum Aeromed is your trusted partner in air medical solutions. Experience safety and innovation with their customized interiors, designed for both rotor and fixed-wing aircraft. Elevate your patient care with Spectrum Aeromed. For more information, visit spectrum-aeromed.com.
You know what's funny about it starts at the beginning too. So when I left to go up there, Brian Parker, he had a person that was going to go to work for us. And I don't get the whole story; it doesn't really matter. But I'm told to drive up there and to be there the next morning. His father was working there; he had to come back, and so I was going to fill that slot on the ground first. That's initially ground and water rinses. Learn the job. Mm-hmm. And so he said, however, he said, when you're driving up there, I need you to stop and I need you to pick up somebody on the way there. I said, okay. I'm not real sure. That's fine. So I, on the way up there, I stopped by and he gave me an address, and I stopped by the address, and it was the Martin County Correctional Institute. And so apparently there was somebody that I had to pick up that was going to be working with us. That was a friend, family type thing. And so I picked him up from being released and drove him to Georgia with me. So that was an interesting drive. I was, really not sure how that was going to work out. Worked out fine, but that was it. That's how it started. So I got up there and the first thing that happened, you're 18 years old, you just leave. It was my first time out of the house. Wasn't really planned. And I remember I got to the pilot house, which was, to be very, very frank, this was old slave quarters. This was on a farm in a place called Collins, Georgia. One yellow flash. We were out in the middle of a cotton area, and this house had not ever been rebuilt. They added a kitchen on the back of it. It was an interesting thing, but the history and the feeling of that place was just unbelievable. And I got there that first night, go in, crash down, go to bed, and I get up the next morning. I'm going to walk out, and I got to get a shower, right? And to my surprise, nobody had any soap there. There was no towels. There was no shaving cream. There was no razor. And I remember waking up going, boy, you ain't in Kansas anymore. So I had to borrow and beg and steal from two of the other guys that were there. They're laughing. They thought it was funny. But that day I had to own my own stuff. So the introduction to adulthood was in parallel to the introduction to pilothood. It all happened on the same day.
Yeah.
And some of the things that I learned out there, the basics were people skills. I'm meeting farmers and having to do things. I hated school. I hated math. But when you start doing 3 ounces to the acre and you got gallons of this and it's got to work, because if not, you're going to kill everything he's got. It became real important real fast as to the requirements that I was in and what I had to do. And I had great people that we all got thrust together. I had a lead pilot from New Zealand, and he was really good. We're flying R-22s. So the Robinson R-22 is the aircraft that had a Apollo DTN-3 spray system, had a little 2-stroke engine on it, and a little switch on the cyclic to spray on and off. And depending upon, what load, you usually get about 13 acres to a load, something like that. It was all it was. So it was all day, 40-gallon batches. It was a quick run. Learned a lot about it. Now I also learned how to fly. We had this thing called the Georgia jumping tree, and it'd jump out in front of you pretty quick, and it was on those hot Georgia days. It was amazing how hot it was, and the DAs, even that low from a sea level perspective, you weren't really that high, but the temperatures were just so hot that the way you would take off in that helicopter, I didn't know what was wrong. I knew what I was taught.
Yeah.
So back then, the low rotor horn in the R-22 came on at 95%. This is long before governors or anything like that, no SFARs. So the takeoff procedure was real simple. You'd throw on 40 gallons, add a couple of gallons of gas. You would roll the RPM up to 110%, which is the top red line, well above where it's supposed to be. You would pull power to wherever, because the rotor was going to droop. I've seen 30 inches of manifold pressure out of that thing. It's crazy. And you would try and get through effective translational lift before you got the low rotor horn. And that was every single takeoff all day long, right? Morning to night.
God, Randy.
And so, hey, let me tell you something. People wonder why I like Robinsons. And I still have an admiration for that aircraft, because there is absolutely no reason I'm still sitting here, because I did that. We did that for a long time. And flying that aircraft, it wasn't, these are low volume row crops, peanuts and corn and things like that. But learned a lot during that period. Also learned a lot about myself and relationships. A lot of the conventional ag sprayers that were there didn't like us. So we went to try to go to a few parties, had our tires cut a couple times, at some of these events.
This sounds like Yellowstone, the show.
Oh, dude, it's all factual. That's the funny part. We went to a place
really
called.
Good part.
We went to a party one night called Jam the Dam. So it was a party. It was this old house near a dam, and there's paint all over it and crap. Everybody goes, "Oh, condemned house," but they, kids are, right? And so we went out there and had a great time, and we actually met these crop dusters, these younger people that were at that party, and guy's name was Tony, and he was the guy to be afraid of. He was the bad dude out of their group. And I remember I just walked up to him and said, "Hey man, I'm from Florida. I don't know the rules around here, and I heard I pissed you off, and I apologize, and no intent of doing that." And he looked at me, and we actually became, I don't want to say friends, but while I was there the whole time, all of our problems stopped, and
your tires were intact, and
yeah. Tires stayed intact after that. We were good. But the irony of that meeting, because I do believe they were involved in some of that, that situation. When that happened, which was that night, when that happened, he actually presented his truck for us to drive to get tires to fix our truck. And even though I knew they were involved in, what had happened. So I thought, that moment, that taught me a lot about life and how to engage and how to talk and try and talk people off the ledge and not push you off the ledge sometimes. Yes. But that really was a big learning curve. And that was Georgia, man. That was that whole experience.
Wow. That is amazing. So going back to the R22, where was the pesticide, for a better word? Where was all that at? Was it on the belly?
Yeah, on the belly. There's a tank, a 40-gallon tank, mounts to the gear. Actually, a really neat system. And it just went right underneath you, and then it had a little 2-stroke engine right here, and that would feed a tube that went to the mount for the spray boom, and you had a 40-foot spray swath.
Wow, 40 foot with a
40 foot. I had my first couple times I had some things occur on that. I mean, I had some engine problems once, and we had a kid that was back then you didn't have AgNav, right? You didn't have, a computer. It was somebody with a flag at the end of the field, and they'd walk 40 feet. You'd see a flag pop up again, and that's how we did it. And the kid's name that we hired, his name was Possum, and that was his name. It wasn't a joke. That was his name. And Possum was a good kid, but he would be bored out there all day himself, walking along. And so his game at the end of the day was how many snake heads he could bring back in.
Yeah.
And, the kid had just guts of steel. But he would walk all day long anywhere we drop him off. And I had him one night flying along in a place called Claxton, Georgia, the home of the fruitcake, right? Claxton, Georgia. And I still don't think there's any more than one fruitcake. It just gets passed around, but that's debatable. But anyway, I'm there, and they had underground fuel tanks. We got some fuel, and my aircraft started to misbehave, and I had to put it down 2 times with him in this dairy farm. And we found out it was just bad gas, but it actually wasn't bad. It was water. And I remember, you're 18, you have this problem. I put it down and hit the ground on this aircraft, and Possum's sitting in the aircraft. He's with me. I was ferrying him to a field, and he didn't get out. And, the aircraft, it just probably smooths out. And I get out of the aircraft like I know what I'm doing. I get out and I remember tapping on the spark plugs, and I'm playing with stuff, Looks good to me. So I get back in it and spool it back up and do it again. And then the same thing happened again, but this time it meant it. And I remember we're sitting on the ground. The aircraft is not running anymore. And I hear this, Mr. Randy. He says, yeah. I look over, it's Possum. He says, he's looking straight ahead. He's hanging on to that seat, man. He's just hanging on to that seat. He goes, can we not do that anymore? And that was his response. I said, yeah, Possum, you're good, man. Get out. We won't do that anymore. We're all good. But he had squeezed that seat so hard that his fingerprints from the oil on that black paint underneath the seat in the R22, he could still see his fingerprints, So I told him he's a brave kid getting in there after that happened.
So
a lot of stories in Georgia, man. A lot of stories. Oh my gosh.
So for somebody listening has connections. Paramount Plus is looking for shows all the time. And I can see this. I mean, just who will play Possum in the Randy Rowles bio
that would be a unique character. Had to be a unique character. But
Oh my gosh.
real quick, I got to tell you real quick one more thing, and on Georgia and all that. But three quick stories. So real fast. One, had a customer that wanted me to pick up a paycheck at a gas station he owned, right? So I would land behind it. I went into this game shop, they call it, like a game area, like pool and everything. So I go in and there's this massive box on the back wall. So they have a guy, it's a Jamaican dude with dreadlocks. He works for the farmer. So he says, hey, come on, man, let me show you this. So I walk to the back room, loaded with rattlesnakes, the whole thing. And he is putting his hands, they won't strike you. Well, I go to look in there and the guy grabs the back of my leg when I did that. And needless to say, they were playing a joke on me, but there was smoke on my heels going out of that place. I got my check and left. I was done. And then we had a mechanic. He thought it'd be funny one night. He comes in. We're in the middle of nowhere. So he comes in, and if Al Kernan watches this, he remembers this. But he went in there, and he loaded up an AR-15, and he gets in the hallway. And the way this house was is you just had a long hallway all the way through it with rooms on the side. Well, he opened the front door and got inside that place at about 2 a.m. because he was up there to do a 100-hour by himself, so he wanted to make sure everybody was awake. And he pulled off rounds in that hallway in the middle of the night, and that's how we all woke up. And I was out the window. Window up, I was gone. So those are the kind of antics that, when you're out there in the utility world, the ag world, that people play on each other. Now, I would tell you now that was probably one of the best times of my life. That was probably one of the best times of my life. Had a lot going on at home with family and, wasn't doing my responsibility in certain areas. But at the end of the day, from a pilot learning and a young man being introduced to adulthood, some of the best people and best times I've ever had.
Yeah. Just Possum alone is worth.
Just Possum alone. Dude.
Imagine going through life and you didn't meet Possum. I mean, what the heck? It just isn't right. I can only imagine the things that you learned flying that R-22 low level over those fields that you use to this day, that you will use tonight, that just a touch, a feel, probably can't even explain some of it, but there's no doubt in my mind that some of that has stuck with you all these years that you learned over those fields. Can you pick something?
Yeah, I mean, there is the feel, the power management, things of that nature. Yeah. I agree. And you learn a little bit. I would say what the takeaway for me and where my career is today, one is understanding the job. My life is training. Anyone that knows me, my passion is training, teaching, and I'm agnostic to what you use the helicopter for. I think that's not my business. If you've chosen to operate a helicopter and you're doing some level of work with it, my goal is to make you safer. I really believe that. So when it's the ag world, I've flown with a lot of folks that have never done an auto rotation below 300, 400, 500 feet.
Right.
And so for a lot of years now, I go out and contract at the beginning of spray season. And one thing we do, especially with a company called the Heli Team, I go to Illinois, and that's just one of many, but we take their long rangers and we do all their engine failures from spray profiles. So we're 10 feet, 90 knots, and doing throttle cuts. And, you can come out of the turn and do throttle cuts. Show them in a very safe environment how to operate the aircraft when bad things happen. The irony is it's not that they're having engine failures. They want to practice there. They need to practice there. The irony is that they hit wires. They lost one this year, and luckily the pilot survived it. But it's the fatigue. It's not really careless. It's not complacency. I mean, guys are really doing a good job with a lot of that. But at the end of the day, you're tired. The sun's in your face. Maybe one field you recon and you miss something. That's where my passion lies, is to be able to understand the job and talk about not just the engine failures, but to go out and talk about the things where the data shows the accidents are actually occurring. And that's probably the greatest benefit of having done all the different mission segments, is to be able to understand the role and then be able to provide a training program that helps them when they're actually doing it.
Wow. And for those of the people that know you, they know what I'm about to say is absolutely true, is that you just mentioned you're agnostic about what they use it for. You, in your positions over the years to come that we're going to talk about, have trained helicopter pilots in every single profession with a helicopter that there is. I mean, they've all attended some sort of class with you at HAI or at Helicopter Institute or at the other helicopter businesses that you've run. But that not too many people can say that. They're usually, I mean, kind of staying in one lane. You're in a big wide lane of just rotorcraft. Is that am I accurate in that?
Bell is proud to sponsor Vertical Helicasts and their vision to hold meaningful mission, safety, and best practice conversations in the helicopter industry. The lessons learned from these conversations will undoubtedly shape the future of both new and veteran helicopter operators.
Yeah, and Jack, that's how we met, right? I mean, if we go back, a lot of folks was the law enforcement side. And, early on, 1990, I first went to the work when I was doing all the flying and all the things that happened. But, when I was being an explorer at the sheriff's department, you meet folks. And so even though I had met Gary Young back then, I never thought that was a quick path. That thing at Bell, that was a dream. And I realized later in life that a dream is not a plan, right? I now know that you make a plan out of it. That's that why not me mindset. But being at the sheriff's department, I had been teaching a lot of guys how to fly and stuff as a young flight instructor, TFOs and so forth. And they said, you ought to come to work for us. And so in 1990, I went to work for the sheriff's department. Worked there a couple of years. And I really thought that was the path that I wanted to get into and go to work for the aviation unit. But I realized that, to be very frank, and for all the folks in all the political world, there's a lot of politics involved. And I have a really bad habit of voicing my opinion. And my wife calls me a change agent, and that's just another word for probably being a pain in the ass sometimes. But at the end of the day, I really have a bad habit of going in and looking at things and trying to see how you change things. And there's not change there. There's some pieces there that stay the same. And so I was able to take from that time and move on. And I moved into a company called Air Coastal Helicopters and a guy by the name of Dan Crow. I've known Danny since I started. He was the chief pilot. He had been with the sheriff's department in Palm Beach County since probably around 80, 82, somewhere in that ballpark. And he left, and I think it was 89 when he left, but he was the chief helicopter pilot for them. And very good friend, really another mentor. I'm going to circle back around to people again here in a minute. But, when I wanted to leave the sheriff's department, I called Danny, and he's like, dude, come to work for me. He said, let's just figure this out. And so there was no plan. He had an R-22 and a bunch of Jet Rangers and Long Rangers and stuff. And so I went there, and he basically said, do what you want. See how you can make this work. And so I sat down, and I remember I started writing, if you remember fax machines, right? So I started writing these letters, and I faxed them to all these attorneys' offices and doctors' offices in the area, about a 10-mile radius, everything I could find a fax number for. And I was offering pilot training. I started doing anything in an R-22. You want to learn to fly? Come out. And so I went from, in 2 weeks, doing nothing to a full 8-hour-a-day schedule in the R-22s. It was that fast. It just started. People wanted to learn to fly. And when you start talking in the early 90s, there weren't a lot of options. And so when people that had the money that could do it, they wanted to do it. So we built up the flight school. And I went back to Danny and I said, listen, here's the deal. I want to build as much as I can for your company and keep you guys working because I'm here now. And, you're in your early 20s. I'm very energetic. And I said, the only caveat is I want to have the opportunity to fly everything. I want first right of refusal for flying any of the jobs that I put together. So anything I'm doing and that I want to fly it. And of course, for him, he's like, yeah, sure. I don't have to work on the weekends. That'd be great. So I started flying. Moroso Motorsports Park was a big drag strip. Tons and tons of people go there, right? Moroso, you see their name in like car parts. That's how big these guys were. So I set a deal with them and I did all the races and everything like that for them and just cities and events and everything. We also did the South Florida Fair. My first real malfunction, I would say, on an aircraft that got my attention was out there doing rides. And we were doing a place called the Heritage Festival, which is the South Florida Fairgrounds. And they had put the helicopter rides right on the midway. And it had a 6-foot fence right around the whole midway, but around us, like a little square. You probably get 2 Jet Rangers in this little square, relatively snug. And so it's dark. I'm doing rides. The ride would be kind of an high energy kind of ride, climb here, do this, a couple tight turns. Well, I would bring it to an out of ground effect hover and about 500 feet, and then just drop the collective, come left, come back and land in the spot. Well, I'm out there as out of ground effect hover, and all these people, they're hooting and hollering. And on the freewheeling unit of a Jet Ranger, 3 of the bolts on the back side of that drive shaft broke. And so the whole thing misaligned and it cracked the housing out of the freewheeling unit. And so it was slamming into the top. I mean, it was just it was like a sledgehammer up there. Lost all the oil out of the transmission. I mean, everything lit up. So I'm putting the collective down and I come back around and the only place the most natural place to land is the place I've been landing. It was right there. So I come in and Samantha, my wife, we've gotten back together at this point, and she's loading. So I come in, I sit it on the ground, throttle off, and there's oil smell. I mean, no one's saying a word in the helicopter. They're quiet, right? And after we're on the ground, still hear the sledgehammer on the top of them. They start, yeah, this is great. They have no idea how close all this came. They think it was the best ride they've ever had, in the world. And Samantha's out there. She's looking, and I tried to pull the rotor brake, and it yanks it out of my hand. I mean, it was jacked up there. And Samantha's looking at me, and I see that kind of RCA dog look, and she goes, and so she just walks 4 more people, and I'm like, no, we're done. We're done. So the funny part, especially for newer pilots out there, I call my boss back then the cell phone was like this, right? So I call him. I say, hey, Danny. He said, yeah, I got a problem with the helicopter. Drive shaft came out of this thing on me. And he says, okay, I'll be there in a minute. So he shows up in another helicopter and lands next to me in that little spot. That's how I landed on the right side, and he landed on the left side. He gets there, looks at it. Yep, it's broke. I said, all right. And he says, well, where's your car? I said, what do you mean? He said, where's your car? I'm going to drive back there. You can keep flying the other helicopter. We had like an hour to wait. So he kept making me work, man. I had to keep flying that night. So that was my boss. And like I said, he'll say I love him to death, still a very close friend. But early in the career, I would say things are done today much different than they were back then. I think everybody knows. I remember having to fly the rest of that night. And they're like, here we go. What are the odds? I'm probably safer than I've ever been in this helicopter right now. We're good.
You're flying a mission and that happens. And hey, go. There's another one back in the hangar. Go fly.
Yeah. It was crazy. I think back on it and I'm like, how did that happen? It was crazy, but yeah, it was good times, but
that is amazing. So here you are, you're doing that. What's next? Because there's a long list here of things. What's next? What happened after that?
Right after that, the guy, Danny, he looked at me and he needed a chief pilot. And, I didn't meet the time requirements. And so he put in a deviation or waiver with the FAA, and I got evaluated. And I mean, it was an evaluation, man. It was a trip. These dudes came in. Back then, the FAA had plenty of helicopter pilots, and they had good quality helicopter pilots. I mean, it wasn't a joke. And so they came in, did an evaluation, and they gave me authorization to be the chief pilot of the organization. So I took that job. But while they were there, one of them, his name is Dick Engler. He's retired from the FAA, but he's still doing some examiner administrative stuff. Great guy. He said, have you ever thought about being a pilot examiner? I think I'm 23 at the time when this happens. And I said, no, I said, I've never thought about it. I never even really, I know I got a check ride from one, but what does it entail? So he told me, and I said, yeah. I said, that sounds like a good time. I mean, I'd like to do that. That'd be a lot of fun. And so I went to school to be a DPE, and then they gave me authorization, to be a DP in the early 90s.
Wow.
And I at the time, my understanding, I was one of the youngest DPs they've ever had, youngest in helicopters for sure. They gave me authorization to do all helicopter check rides. So at that point, I was doing everything, private through ATP, CFI, II. And so the biggest reason they came to me about it wasn't because I could do anything special. It's just everybody else didn't want to do touchdown auto rotations in an R-22. Yeah. And so now it was proliferating in the training world. And so they needed somebody who could do touchdowns, especially on CFI check rides. And so I was kind of the sucker kid. That's how I got the TPE thing. So my very first check ride was at a company in Fort Lauderdale. They're since gone, so I'll say the name of it, a company called Heliflight. And I went down there to do a check ride, and I knew some of the instructors and everything. And I walked in, and there's a show called Punked, I think is what it is. Everybody's seen this called Punked, right? Well, it wasn't a thing back then, but if you know the emotion of thinking you're being punked, right?
Yeah.
That's what I thought this was. So I go in, and I'm giving this check ride to a guy. Guy's got probably 6,000, 7,000 hours, flies for a big government contracting agency. And they're still around. But I give him this check ride, and he shows up, and he has a FAR book, FAR-AIM, that's 2 years expired. And I mean, that's one of many things, right? So I'm going through this check ride, and these are the old days, right? Everything's in paper. I mean, it's a whole different world. I'm waiting for any second somebody to jump out from behind a mirror to come in the door and say, hey, you did good. This is a good. So I had to unsat the guy. So my very first check ride was a CFI initial on an unsat, and I had every emotion come at me. I had, people being upset about it, saying that the FAR aim, it really doesn't matter if it's expired because, it's they don't change much anyway. And it was crazy. But that was my first check ride I ever gave. And so that was an interesting piece. But that Dick Engler also did something else for me. He made a recommendation. And he said, flight safety is looking for in West Palm Beach, and flight safety was great. They had the Sikorsky contract. Sikorsky had signed a 20-year contract just right at that same time frame that they would do all the training for Sikorsky, flight safety would. And so Dick said, you ought to put out a resume over there. And now being an examiner, you could help them as a training center evaluator, TCE, and do check rides and help them out, especially with my 135 stuff. So I did. And a couple weeks later, I told Engler, I said, hey, I haven't heard anything. He goes, let me check in. Well, he checked in, and the guy that was the director of training had circular filed my resume because of my age. And he was like, you're not going to stay here type thing. And
by circular fire, you mean trash, right?
I mean the trash. Absolutely the trash. You got the right one. So it was gone, man. I was out of the running. And he said, you ought to give this guy a chance. And I'm going back to my people thing, man. And he talked to him, and he did. The guy calls me and he said, are you interested in a job? I was like, yeah. And back then it was 7 on, 7 off, because they did so many oil and gas people with Sikorsky that they matched their work schedule. So the instructors would match the kind of the schedule with PHI and some other big companies, Airlog. And so it was a 7 on, 7 off schedule. That meant I could still do all my flying on the outside. And back then I was flying for everybody, man. I was flying for myself. I was running the chief pilot. I was flying for the water management district. Those guys I told you about earlier, I ended up flying for them part-time. So I was doing a lot of flying, and that diversity of corporate to utility to all that was really helpful for me. Anyway, they gave me a job. I was working 7 on, 7 off, and I worked there for quite some time. I was there a long time, late 90s all the way to about 2004, but most of it was part-time. And the reason it was part-time was when you go to work there was a policy that you're not supposed to work outside. You're not supposed to do anything on the outside. They didn't want you to do that. And it was a liability back to flight safety. And later on, you had the Thurman Munson accident. That was a flight safety pilot. I mean, all that stuff, right? So I get pulled into the office one day, and the center manager pulls me out. The guy's name is Pat Knott. Great guy, old Air Force guy, T-38 guy. I mean, I think he flew B-52s or something, but just an all around nice man, something a joy to work for. And he calls me into the office and he says, all right, Randy, here's the deal. He said, you can't fly anymore on the outside. And I'm like, whoa, what do you mean I can't fly? He goes, nope, working full time here, you cannot fly anymore on the outside. I'm like, okay, well, he said, however, if you would like to come to work here part-time, I will give you $50 an hour, and I will let you work whatever schedule you want. You can work as many hours as you want to work. You can do it however you want to work it. And I don't care what you do on the outside. You just can't do it if you're full-time. So I'm like, $50 an hour, pay raise. Plus I can do as much as I want. Yeah. And the only thing I lose is that little health insurance thing that my wife already has. He goes, yeah. I was like, where do I sign up? That's when I take that job. So I did. And the next day, I got a phone call from the guys with Sikorsky that I was training for, that actually had some customers that they needed a flight instructor for. And it was a big setup. He let me go to be able to do part-time work, already setting me up to do work with Sikorsky as an instructor pilot. And so that's how I started going out in the S-76 doing training, kind of being bounced around. And some of the guys out of West Palm had Nick Lapis, which some of you know from maybe the flight instructor refresher course, which is he was the original S-76 production pilot. Nick became a very dear friend of mine. He's the one that actually showed me the ropes in the 76 out there. And then guys like Phil Pacini and all these. I mean, that Sikorsky experience was unbelievable. But it was another OEM and flight safety was, how do you treat a customer? How do you treat a customer? And I asked the question of myself at that time, why is it that a helicopter pilot has to wait until they get to that level of flying before they get treated like a real customer? Why is it the crew resource management piece and the instrument refresher things? Why is it that that's not happening in the smaller flight schools? And you literally have to go to work for somebody and they send you to a flight training facility and you have this epiphany that the flight training could be so much more. And so that experience really, along with getting to know Gary Young at Bell, that was the seed that was planted for Randy Rowles to want to build training facilities that stood out among the others. That is why I wanted to do that. I wanted to bring that level of training, that level of customer service to an industry that was being ignored. And I'm very proud to say that I think we've done that, and we've done that very, very well.
Yeah, you have. That's neat that you can look back on that, that moment where it went bing and you go, wow. And, years later, through a lot of hard work in between, the Helicopter Institutes exists and is still growing and still adding things that you offer, products that you offer, services that you offer. That's really cool that you can pinpoint that to that time period where it just the light bulb went on. Very cool.
It was cool, and as I said, I think you guys are now learning the circulation of people. It's been amazing, and it wasn't long after that during that time frame that I'd been doing a lot of flying for a lot of different folks, and one of the things that happened was at the Sheriff's Department, there was a guy, Gary Hogan, that was there, and didn't know Gary well, but Gary and I got to know each other. I was able, a lot of times through the DPE thing, I got to know people for doing CFI refreshers and renewals. That was a big thing. And way back then, in the 90s, is with Gary Young, I got my first invitation after 1993 was my first Heli Expo. So for AJI, my plug-in to Heli Expo was, again, in Miami. Last time they ever went there, first and last. But we had a show down there, and, I attended that show. If we circle back to that guy, Wayne Wiesman, I mentioned in the Channel 12 helicopter at the very, very beginning, I met as a young man. As I said, I met him again at the Sheriff's Department. So I met Gary Young at the Sheriff's Department as Explorer, but Wayne Wiesman was also a previous pilot and did all our local flight training for him. So anything that was going on for certification for the Sheriff's Department, Wayne did it. I met him there. So those two key figures for me, I met at the Sheriff's Department hangar. And Wayne really became a good friend of mine after that. I would fly with Wayne a lot in old Sikorskis, an H-19 or an S-55. And years later, that S-55, through a company called Orlando Helicopter Airways that built it, which had the Hind lookalike for the Army Apaches to fight, that turned into Vertical Aviation Technologies, a guy named Fred Clark. And they built all the helicopters for Papillon in the Grand Canyon called the Whisper Jet. If you remember the big 2-story Whisper Jets. Well, I was fortunate enough to learn to know that aircraft and then do all the training on that aircraft when it was put into the Grand Canyon. It was an amazing ship. Well, that was through Wayne Wiesman. What's the key part there? Well, 1993, my first time going to Heli Expo was to bring a Sikorsky S-55 into the show, one of those old helicopters. So we were on the floor. I saw Gary Young there, Chuck Aaron. Do you guys remember Chuck Aaron from Red Bull?
Sure.
Chuck and I got to really meet each other, and we're still friends today. But he had a company called Syra Corporation, brought in an old Cobra, beautiful Cobra that he had on the floor in 93. And again, I remember this like yesterday. I have so much passion for this industry when these things happen. It just doesn't go away. But 93 is when Gary kind of offered me an opportunity to start teaching in the flight instructor refresher course at HAI. And I still do that to this day. It is the longest standing, constantly held flight instructor refresher course in existence, over 40 years now. We don't have as many people because the online stuff kind of changed how things are done, but it's still, a very prideful thing to be a part of that. And that really started out the HAI part, which is still a big part of my career today.
Before we go any further, I want to, you talk about people a lot. And on the podcast, we talk a lot about the importance of networking. And that's a focus of a lot of the trade shows you go to and a lot of the things you do. You're like the embodiment of what we're describing. The importance of networking can be seen in your career and the development of your business and all the things that you've done over the course of your life. And I really think it's cool to hear you tell these stories because I really do think it's a great example for folks on the importance of networking with people and treating people right. Because if you go and meet these folks, but you don't treat them right, you create a bad name for yourself. Our community is small. You're going to do yourself a disservice. But you treat people right, you do a good job, and you take that, doors are going to open. And it's really cool to hear you talk about your career and your life in that way, because you can see that. So I just have to comment on that. That's really cool. Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Hangar Z podcast. Don't forget to like and subscribe to hear more stories that promote the personnel and equipment behind the missions in public safety aviation. Lastly, stand by for a message after a word from our sponsors. Cheers.
Bell is proud to sponsor Vertical Helicasts and their vision to hold meaningful mission, safety, and best practice conversations in the helicopter industry. The lessons learned from these conversations will undoubtedly shape the future of both new and veteran helicopter operators.
Thanks to our sponsor, Summit Aviation, a full-service provider for business, government, parapublic, and military aviation, specializing in maintenance, modifications, avionics, interiors, and paint. Discover more at summit-aviation.com.
Thank you to our sponsor, Spectrum Aeromed. Spectrum Aeromed is your trusted partner in aeromedical solutions. Experience safety and innovation with their customized interiors, designed for both rotor and fixed-wing aircraft. Elevate your patient care with Spectrum Aeromed. For more information, visit spectrum-aeromed.com. Thank you for joining us for this two-part series of the Hangar Z podcast, brought to you by Vertical Helicasts. It's been a true privilege to welcome Randy Rowles to the Hangar Z podcast. Randy's inspiring journey from dropping out of high school to becoming the owner and president of the Helicopter Institute is a remarkable testament to resilience and determination. His story reminds us all of the pivotal moments that can shape our passions and the profound effect that mentorship and community can have on our dreams. Throughout our conversation, Randy emphasized the vital role of networking and relationships in professional growth, sharing his firsthand experiences from his time at Bell Helicopter and the challenges he faced at Silver State. The founding of the Helicopter Institute showcases his commitment to high-quality training and highlights the importance of fostering a supportive environment in the helicopter industry. As we wrap up this series, let's take Randy's message to heart. With grit, determination, and the support of others, we can navigate any challenges and realize our aspirations. Thank you for tuning into the Hangar Z podcast. Cheers.
Time to close up the hangar. Thanks for joining us on the Hangar Z podcast, brought to you by Vertical Helicasts.